April 7, 1945, the East China Sea. A young officer named Mitsuru Yoshida stood on the bridge of the largest warship ever built. He stared at a glowing radar screen. One dot appeared, then 10, then 100, then more than he could count. Yoshida already knew how this day would end. Every sailor on that ship knew. They had not been sent out to win. They had been sent out to die, and the ship beneath their feet was supposed to be unsinkable. That word unsinkable is where this story breaks open, because here's the thing that should not make sense. The ship under Yoshida's boots was the most powerful battleship the world had ever seen, the biggest, the heaviest. It carried the largest naval guns ever put on a warship, and in just a few hours, it would be dead at the bottom of the sea. Not because it lost a fight with another battleship. It never fired those giant guns at an enemy ship, not even once. It was killed by airplanes, 386 of them. Hold that number in your head, 386. We will come back to it, and when we do, you will understand why no amount of steel could have saved her. But to understand how the most powerful ship on Earth ended up as a target in the sky, you have to go back. Back before the planes, back before the war even reached Japan's home waters, back to a fenced-off corner of a shipyard where thousands of men were building something so secret. They were told they could be killed for talking about it. This is the story of the battleship Yamato, and it is not really a story about a ship. It is a story about pride, about a country that built a giant to win a war that giants could not win anymore, and about 3,000 men who sailed out knowing the truth, while the world that built them looked away. Let's start with the secret. In November of 1937, in the city of Kure, near Hiroshima, workers laid down the first steel of a new ship at the Kure Naval Arsenal. Nothing about it looked normal. The dry dock where they built her was wrapped up like a present nobody was allowed to open. The Japanese Navy hung huge screens made of woven mats, rope, bamboo, and cloth all around the site. From the air, you would see almost nothing. From the next street over, you would see a wall, and the men inside that wall, they lived under a kind of fear most workers never feel. They were sworn to silence under threat of death. Think about that. Not a fine, not a warning. They were told that if they spoke about what they were building, it could cost them their lives. Even high-ranking officers in their own navy were not told everything. The true size of the guns, the single most important secret, was known to only a tiny handful of men at the very top. So picture a worker walking home from a shift in 1938. He has spent all day inside that wall. His wife asks what he did today, and he says nothing. He can say nothing. He carries the biggest secret in the country home in his chest, and he eats his dinner, and he says nothing at all. That is how badly Japan wanted to hide this ship. The question is why? The answer is a number, and it is the first of many you need to feel, not just hear. In those years, the great naval powers of the world had signed treaties. These were deals that limited how big a battleship could be. The agreed ceiling was around 35,000 tons. That was the rule. That was the polite size everyone promised to stay under. Japan broke that promise in the most spectacular way possible. The Yamato, fully loaded, would weigh close to 72,000 tons. Let me put that in plain terms, because 72,000 tons is just noise until you can picture it. She was almost twice the size the rules allowed. She was bigger than any battleship the Americans or the British had ever floated by a wide margin. If the agreed size was a heavyweight boxer, Japan had quietly built something the size of two heavyweights and stitched them together, and then hidden it behind a curtain of bamboo, so no one would know the fight was unfair. That was the whole idea. Japan knew it could never outbuild the United States. America had more factories, more steel, more men, so Japan made a bet. If we cannot build more ships than them, the thinking went, we will build better ones, bigger ones. Ships so strong that one of ours could stand against many of theirs. The Yamato was that bet, made out of steel. And before her first piece of armor was even bolted on, her designers tested more than 50 different hull shapes to get her right. 50. They were not guessing. They were chasing perfection, and they were spending a fortune to find it. So what did all that secrecy and money actually build? Here is where the awe starts, and I want to take it slowly. one piece at a time, because the size of this ship is the whole reason the rest of the story hurts the way it does. Start with her body. The Yamato measured about 263 meters long. That is roughly 860 feet. Stand her up on her end, and she would tower over almost any building in the world at that time. Lay her flat, and she would stretch longer than 2.5 football fields, end to end. Now think about the men who lived inside her. At full strength, the Yamato carried more than 3,000 sailors. 3,000. That is not a ship's crew. That is a small town. A floating town with engines, gun crews, cooks, doctors, and radio men, all sealed inside one steel hull, moving across the ocean together. But the size of her body is not what made the world afraid. What made the world afraid were her guns. And the guns are where we slow all the way down. The Yamato carried 9 main guns. They were 18.1-inch guns in metric 460 millimeters. They remain, to this day, the largest guns ever fitted to any warship in history. Not the largest of the war, the largest ever. Before or since, nothing has topped them. Now, big guns is easy to say and hard to feel. So let me hand you a yardstick. Each shell those guns fired weighed about 1.5 tons. One shell, 1.5 tons of steel and explosive, roughly the weight of a small car, and the Yamato could throw that small car through the air for more than 26 miles. Sit with that for a second. 26 miles. If you fired one of these guns from the middle of a large city, the shell would land in the next city over, far past anything you could see with your own eyes. The gun crew aiming it could not even see what they were shooting at. They were hurling cars over the horizon, and she had 9 of these guns. When all 9 fired together, a full broadside, the Yamato threw close to 60,000 pounds of steel at the enemy in a single thundering moment. 30 tons, in one breath. That is the weight of a loaded truck, leaving the ship in one flash of fire and smoke so violent that the blast could knock men off their feet if they stood in the wrong place. That was the Yamato's promise. One ship that hit like a fleet, and we have not even talked about her armor yet. This is the part that gives the whole story its cruel little twist. So remember it. The designers did not just make the Yamato hit hard. They made her almost impossible to kill. Her deck armor, in the places that mattered most, was over 9 inches thick. Thick enough, they believed, to shrug off bombs dropped from the sky and shells fired from far away. Her builders used a smart, brutal design idea. Pile the heaviest protection around the vital organs, the engines, the magazines, the command centers, and accept thinner skin everywhere else. Protect what kills you. Save weight on the rest. The result was a ship that her own designers believed could survive almost anything. On paper, she was nearly immune even to her own monstrous guns. And out of that math came one dangerous, comforting word that people started to attach to her: unsinkable. There is that word again. The same word Mitsuru Yoshida would think about. On the bridge, years later, as the radar screen filled up with dots. Because here is the trap that pride sets. When you build something you believe cannot be killed, you stop asking how it might die. The men who designed the Yamato were thinking about other battleships. Big gray giants firing big shells across the water. That was the war they were preparing for. That was the fight they built her to win. They were preparing for the wrong war. And while Japan was bolting 9-inch armor onto a ship to stop shells, on the other side of the ocean, a completely different kind of weapon was quietly getting better and better. A weapon that did not care how thick your deck was. A weapon that came from above. But that part comes later. We are not there yet. For now, hold the picture. A secret so big that workers risked their lives to keep it. A ship so large, she was almost 2 battleships in one. Guns so powerful they threw cars over the horizon. Armor so thick the world began to whisper that single fatal word. She was finished and made ready for the fleet in December of 1941. And the date matters more than almost any other date in this story, because of what happened just 9 days before. We will get to that date next, and it will tell you everything about the bad timing that doomed the most powerful ship ever built before she even left the harbor. Because the Yamato was not just born in secret. She was born too late. Here is the cruel joke buried at the center of this whole story. The Yamato was finished and handed over to the fleet on the December 10th, 1941. The most powerful battleship ever built was finally ready for war, and she became ready about a week after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now think hard about those two dates sitting side by side. At Pearl Harbor, just days before, Japan had done something that shocked the world. Japanese planes flew off. Aircraft carriers crossed the open ocean and tore apart a row of American battleships sitting in the harbor. Giant ships, proud ships, smashed from the air in a single morning by little planes carrying bombs and torpedoes. Japan had just proven, with its own hands, that airplanes could kill battleships. And in that very same week, Japan finished building the biggest battleship of all time. Do you see it? The country that showed the world the future of war had just spent 4 years and a fortune building a monument to the past. The Yamato was not born into the age she was built for. She was born 1 week into the age that would destroy her. She was a king crowned on the same day the throne was abolished, and nobody on her deck wanted to admit it. That is what I mean when I say she was born too late. But this is the thing about pride. It does not listen. The men who ran Japan's navy still believed in the big ship and the big gun. They had spent their whole lives believing it to them. Pearl Harbor was a clever trick, a surprise punch. The real war, the deciding war, would still be fought the old way. 2 great fleets of battleships meeting on the open sea, firing those enormous shells at each other until one side broke. The Yamato was built to win that battle, the Battle of Giants, and she was about to spend her entire life waiting for a battle that would never come. Her first big moment arrived fast, and it taught a lesson nobody wanted to learn. In June of 1942, the Yamato sailed to the Battle of Midway, and not as just another ship. She went as the flagship of the entire combined fleet. The most important admiral in the Japanese Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto, ran the battle from her bridge, the mightiest ship in the world, carried the mightiest commander in the Navy. On paper, it was the center of Japanese power floating on the sea. And here's what that center of power actually did at Midway. Nothing. Let me show you why. Because this is the moment the whole future of the war turned, and most people watching at the time did not even feel it happen. At Midway, the real fighting was done by airplanes flying off aircraft carriers, just like at Pearl Harbor. American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers and set them on fire, one after another. Japan lost 4 of its big aircraft carriers in a single terrible day. It was a crushing defeat, the kind of blow a country never fully recovers from. And where was the Yamato while Japan's carriers burned? Far behind, hundreds of miles back, out of the action, holding the world's largest guns and unable to fire a single one of them at anything that mattered. The carriers were dying up ahead, and the giant battleship was a passenger to the disaster. Picture Admiral Yamamoto standing on that bridge. The most powerful warship ever built is humming under his feet. 9 guns that can throw a car 26 miles are loaded and ready, and the reports keep coming in. Carrier on fire, carrier on fire, carrier lost. There is nothing those guns can do. The enemy is not a fleet of ships on the horizon. The enemy is a swarm of planes that came and went before the Yamato could even get close. All that steel, all that power, and it could not save a single one of his carriers. That was the lesson of Midway, written in fire. The airplane had taken the crown. The ocean now belonged to the carrier and the bomb. The battleship, the thing Japan had bet everything on, was already becoming a relic. You would think that lesson would change everything. You would think Japan would look at the Yamato and ask a hard question. We built the strongest ship on Earth, and at the most important battle of the year, it did nothing. So what do we do with it now? And here's where the story turns from pride into something sadder, because Japan did not really have an answer. They had built a ship they were too afraid to use and too proud to scrap. She was too valuable to lose, but useless against the kind of enemy that was actually winning the war. So they did the only thing a navy does with a treasure it cannot risk. They hid her. For month after month, the Yamato sat in safe harbors, far from the fighting. Musashi, her sister ship, took over as the fleet flagship in early 1943, and the Yamato drifted into the background. She moved between Japan's protected naval bases, shuffling between Truk and Kure whenever the Americans came too close. The mightiest weapon in the Navy spent the heart of the war, parked at anchor, kept safe like a crown jewel locked in a vault. And the men who served on her felt it. Imagine being a young sailor on the Yamato in 1943. You volunteered to serve on the most famous, most powerful ship in the entire Navy. You expected glory, you expected the biggest battle of the war. Instead, you spend your days in a quiet harbor, polishing brass and watching the sky, while sailors on smaller ships fight and die out where the war actually is. You start to feel less like a warrior and more like a guard standing watch over a museum. That feeling had a name, and it stuck to the ship like a stain. Sailors started calling her the Hotel Yamato. Sit with how sharp that nickname is. A hotel, not a warship, a hotel. Comfortable, safe, a place you visit and relax, while the real work happens somewhere else. The most fearsome battleship in history, and her own Navy joked that she was a floating hotel. That single nickname tells you everything about the strange, hollow shame growing inside that ship. All that power, and nowhere to spend it. And while the Yamato sat at her dock with her giant guns, cooling, the war kept changing in a direction that armor could not stop. This is the part you have to feel building like a storm on the horizon. Every month that passed, the American war machine grew. More carriers, more planes, more pilots. The thing that had killed battleships at Pearl Harbor and burned the carriers at Midway was not slowing down. It was multiplying. The sky over the Pacific was filling up with American aircraft more than anyone in Japan had imagined possible. And the Yamato, she was getting older, more out of date with every sunrise. The enemy that would eventually kill her was being built by the hundreds while she sat still. The Japanese knew, deep down, that something was wrong. They tried to fix it the only way they could. Each time the Yamato came back to port for work, they bolted on more and more small anti-aircraft guns. Little weapons meant to shoot at planes. By the end, she bristled with them, dozens upon dozens of barrels pointing at the sky. But here is the quiet, terrible truth hiding under all that effort. You do not strap 100 small guns onto a ship that was built to rule the seas, unless you have started to fear the thing coming. For it, every new anti-aircraft gun they added was a silent confession. We are afraid of the sky now. We are trying to protect the king from the very weapon that already dethroned him. It would not be enough. Deep down, some of them must have known it would never be enough, because you cannot bolt on enough small guns to stop what was coming. You cannot armor a ship against 386 airplanes at once. No one had ever tried, because no one had ever needed to imagine it. Not yet. For now, the Yamato waited, hidden, aging, carrying the proudest name in the Navy, and the quiet nickname of a hotel, a giant with nothing to fight, in a war that had moved to the sky above her. But the war was about to come and find her. The Americans were not going to let her hide forever. They were closing in, island by island, and very soon the Yamato would finally be ordered into battle. The trouble was the kind of battle it would be, because when the Yamato was at last sent to fight, it would not be the grand duel of giants she was built for. It would be something her sister ship met first, And what happened to her sister? That is the warning. The Yamato sailed straight past. To understand the warning the Yamato ignored, you have to walk with her through the loneliest stretch of her life. Because the next 2 years were not glory. They were slow, quiet decay. By the end of 1943, even the safe harbors were not safe anymore. In December of that year, while the Yamato sat far behind the front lines, an American submarine crept in close and put a torpedo into her side. One torpedo, fired by a single small submarine, exactly the kind of little boat a battleship was built to ignore. It did not sink her, but it tore a wound in her hull, and she had to limp back to the dockyard at Kure to be patched up. Now think about what that quietly proved. The Yamato could not even hide in peace. The war was stretching out its hand and touching her even in the places she went to feel safe. The strongest ship in the world had been bitten by one of the smallest weapons in the war, and there was nothing her giant guns could do about it. And then came an enemy with no face and no guns at all. Not bombs, not torpedoes. Hunger. Not for food, for fuel. This is one of the strangest parts of the whole story, and it shows you just how doomed the Yamato really was. By the middle of 1944, American submarines had hunted down and sunk most of Japan's fleet of fuel tankers. The ships that carried oil were being wiped out, which meant the oil itself was running dry. And the Yamato was a thirsty, thirsty giant. Her fuel tanks could swallow more than 6,000 tons of oil to fill up. Every single time she moved, she drank a fortune in fuel that Japan no longer had. So here is the trap that closed around her. She was too precious to risk in battle, and she was too thirsty to even take out for a sail. Just moving her became a problem the Navy could barely afford. Imagine owning the most powerful car ever built, parked in your driveway, and being too afraid to crash it and too poor to put gas in it. That was the Yamato, a masterpiece, slowly rusting at anchor, because the country that built her could no longer pay to use her. But by October of 1944, Japan ran out of choices. The Americans were storming back into the Philippines. If Japan lost the Philippines, it lost the lifeline to all that oil in the south. This was the breaking point. So Japan gathered up what was left of its great fleet and threw it into one enormous, desperate battle, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest sea fight in history. And for the first time, the two great sisters sailed into a major battle side by side, the Yamato and the Musashi. Watch the Musashi closely now, because what happens to her is the exact warning the Yamato would later ignore. On the 24th of October, American carrier planes found the Musashi, and they did not stop. Wave after wave came out of the sky. Dive bombers and torpedo planes, the same kind of attack that had won at Pearl Harbor and Midway. The Musashi was a Yamato-class ship, just as huge, just as armored, just as unsinkable as her famous sister. She fought back with everything she had, and she fought for about 5 hours. 5 hours. And in the end, it still was not enough. By the time the planes were done, the Musashi had been hit by an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. Let me make that number land, because it is staggering. Add it up. That is 36 separate hits. Most warships in history died from a tiny handful of torpedoes, 2, 3, 4. The Musashi was so tough, so well built, that it took 36 blows to put her under. And she still went under. The second largest battleship the world had ever seen rolled over and sank beneath the waves. But here is the part that should make the back of your neck go cold. Every single one of those 36 hits came from the air. Not one of them came from an enemy battleship. There were no giant guns firing across the water. There was no duel of titans. There was just the sky, opening up and pouring down death. Hit after hit after hit, until the giant simply could not float anymore. More than 1,000 of her men died, and her captain, a man named Toshihiro Inoguchi, chose to go down with his ship. He gave the order for his men to save themselves, turned over command, and quietly went down into his cabin to die with the Musashi as she sank. Remember that choice. A captain refusing to leave his ship sinking with her on purpose. You're going to see that exact choice again before this story ends. Now picture the men on the Yamato. Many of them watched this happen or heard about it within hours. Their sister ship, the only other vessel on Earth like their own, had just been ripped apart by airplanes in a single afternoon, with no enemy battleship anywhere near her. The lesson was written in the water in letters a mile high. In this war, the sky kills the giant. Armor does not save you. Big guns do not save you. The planes win. Every man on the Yamato now knew that for a fact. They had seen the proof with their own eyes. And then the very next day, the Yamato got her. One and only moment of glory. The single time in her entire life. She would do the thing she was built to do. The only time the Yamato ever fired her enormous main guns at enemy ships was here, in the chaos of Leyte Gulf, in a clash called the Battle off Samar. She came around a corner of the sea and ran straight into a small American group, a handful of light escort carriers and a few destroyers. These were not mighty warships. The escort carriers were small, slow, lightly built ships, the kind of force the Yamato should have crushed in minutes. And for a few moments, her guns finally roared. After 3 long years of waiting, the largest guns ever built spoke in anger at last. The Yamato helped sink one of the small American carriers and 1 destroyer. But then comes the bitter twist that sums up her whole sad life. The little American ships did not run. They fought back like cornered animals, throwing everything they had at the giants, and they called in their planes. And the Japanese commanders got confused. The fierce air attacks convinced them they were not fighting a tiny force at all, but a huge and powerful American fleet. Spooked, believing they were outmatched, the Japanese turned around and retreated, leaving behind a small, battered group of American ships they had actually been beating. Read that again, slowly. The most powerful warship ever built finally fired her guns for the first and only time. She was winning. And then she sailed away from her own victory, because a handful of tiny ships fooled her into thinking they were a monster fleet. That was it. That was the Yamato's entire combat career against enemy ships. 1 battle, a few minutes of firing, and a retreat from a fight she was winning. She survived Leyte Gulf and turned for home, but the empire around her was crumbling fast. Her sister lay broken on the seabed. Her fuel was nearly gone. Her war was almost over. And here is where this whole chapter sharpens into a single unforgivable point. Every leader in the Japanese Navy had now watched, with their own eyes, exactly how a Yamato-class battleship dies. They knew it took airplanes. They knew it took no enemy battleship at all. They knew that without protection from the sky, a giant like this was a floating grave waiting to be filled. They knew all of it. So what they decided to do next defies belief. In just a few months, that same Navy would take the Yamato, the last sister, the final giant, and strip her of any real protection from the air. No fleet of friendly planes to guard her, no cover at all. And then they would point her straight at the single largest gathering of American aircraft in the entire Pacific Ocean and order her to sail into it. It was the Musashi's death, ordered all over again on purpose. And the admiral chosen to lead that mission was not a fool. He looked at the plan. He understood completely what it would do to his men. He had seen what happened to the Musashi, and he said no. By the spring of 1945, the war had finally arrived at Japan's front door, and the door was an island called Okinawa. On the 1st of April, 1945, American forces landed on Okinawa. You need to understand what that island meant, because it changes the weight of everything that follows. Okinawa was the last gate. It was Japanese soil. If the Americans took it, the next stop was the home islands themselves, the mainland, the cities, the heart of the country. For Japan, losing Okinawa was the beginning of the end, and everyone in the government knew it. So they panicked, and out of that panic came one of the most desperate decisions of the entire war. The Army and the Navy went to brief the Emperor on how Japan would defend Okinawa. The plan they brought him leaned almost entirely on the air, on huge waves of attacks, including masses of kamikaze pilots, flying their planes straight into American ships. And as they laid it all out, the Emperor reportedly stopped them. With a single stinging question, he asked, in effect, where the Navy was in all of this. The planes were attacking. The pilots were dying, so what about the great ships? Have we no more ships? Let that question hang in the air, because it is the question that killed the Yamato. It was not really a battle plan. It was a wound to the Navy's pride. The Emperor, the most sacred figure in the entire country, had basically asked why the Navy was sitting on the sidelines, while pilots gave their lives. And to the proud men who ran that Navy, there could be only one answer. They had to do something. They had to send a ship. They had to show the Emperor and the dying pilots and the whole nation that the Navy would die too. And the ship they had left to send was the Yamato. So they built a plan around her, and they gave it a grand name. They called it Operation 10 Go, which can be read as Operation Heaven 1. A beautiful name. But underneath that name was one of the coldest orders ever written. Here is what the plan actually asked the Yamato to do. Listen closely, because it is hard to believe a Navy ever ordered this. The Yamato was to sail from Japan all the way to Okinawa with no real protection from the air. Once there, she was to drive herself up onto the shore and beach herself on purpose, grounding the most powerful battleship in the world like a whale stranded on a beach. And there, stuck and unable to move, she was to fire her giant guns at the American invaders until she was blown to pieces. And then, whatever men were still alive were supposed to climb off the wreck, pick up rifles, and keep fighting on land until they died too. That was the mission. Sail until they sink you. Beach what's left. Fire until you're destroyed. Then go ashore and die in the dirt. There was no plan to come home. There was no version of this where the Yamato survives. It was, in plain words, a suicide mission. A special attack, the same gentle phrase the Navy used, for the kamikaze pilots throwing their planes into ships. The Yamato and her escorts were even given a name that says it all out loud: the Surface Special Attack Force, a fleet officially named for the fact that it was being sent out to die. And now look at the size of the force chosen for this impossible job. This is the part where the math becomes cruel. To sail into the largest collection of American sea and air power in the Pacific, Japan sent the Yamato, one single light cruiser, and 8 destroyers. 10 ships. That was the whole fleet. 1 battleship and 9 smaller escorts against an American armada of hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft sitting around Okinawa. It was not a battle. It was a sacrifice with a route map, and somebody had to lead it. That man was Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito. I want you to really meet him, because he is the beating heart of this whole story. And what he carried inside him on that voyage is the part history almost forgot. Ito was not some reckless hothead hungry for a glorious death. He was a thoughtful, careful man, born in 1890 in Fukuoka. He had risen through the Navy steadily, graduating near the top of his class as a young man. And here's the detail that makes his story ache. Years before the war, Ito had actually visited the United States. He had been there. He had seen it with his own eyes, the size of it, the factories, the endless industrial might of the country he was now being ordered to attack. So when the order for Operation 10 Go landed on his desk, Ito did not see honor, he saw the truth. And the truth was simple. This would murder his men for nothing. And so Vice Admiral Ito did something that took more courage than any charge into battle. He refused. He objected to the mission furiously and openly, and even after being pressured, he still would not actually give his ships the order to go. Think about how rare that is. In a military built on absolute obedience, in a culture that prized dying for the emperor above almost anything, this admiral planted his feet and said no. His reasons were not cowardice. They were cold, clear logic, and every one of them was correct. First, he pointed at the sky. His ships would have almost no protection from the air. He had watched the Musashi, a ship just like the Yamato, get torn apart by airplanes only months before, with no enemy battleship anywhere near her. He knew exactly what waited for an unprotected giant. He had seen the proof. Second, he pointed at the numbers. 10 ships against the entire American fleet. It was not a fight anyone could win. It was barely a fight at all. And underneath both of those reasons sat the only question that really mattered to him. The question that makes him human. Across all these years, he was being asked to spend the lives of more than 3,000 of his men. 3,000 sons and husbands and fathers, and get nothing for it. Not a victory. Not even a real chance at one. Just death for the sake of pride. And Ito could not stomach throwing those men away. To make the Navy look brave. That was his wound. Not his own death. He had made peace with that. It was theirs. 3,000 men he could not save, being ordered to die so that important men, far from the fighting, could feel their honor was clean. But here is the tragedy. Being right was not enough. The order did not really come from a General Ito could argue with. The pressure traced all the way up. Ultimate control rested with Admiral Soemu Toyoda, sitting far from the sea near Tokyo. And behind Toyoda stood the weight of the Emperor's own question. That sting about the Navy having no ships left to fight. And in the end, that is what broke Ito's resistance. He was not persuaded that the mission was wise. He was told in so many words that the Emperor was expecting the Navy to make some kind of attack. And against that, there was no argument left to make. To refuse the Emperor's expectation was unthinkable. The wishes of the throne crushed the logic of the Admiral. So Ito stopped fighting, he bowed his head, and he agreed to lead the most powerful ship in the world, and 3,000 of his men, on a voyage he knew was pointless, to a death he had begged them to avoid. Picture that moment. A man who has seen America, a man who has watched the Musashi die, a man who knows beyond any doubt that this mission cannot work and will only fill the sea with his sailors' bodies. And he says yes anyway, because saying no is not allowed. That is not the face of a fanatic. That is the face of a man trapped between his conscience and his duty, choosing duty and hating every step of it. The order was given. The surface special attack force was real. The Yamato would sail. Now came the hardest part of all, because somewhere on that great ship were 3,000 young men who did not yet fully know what their leaders had just decided for them. Somebody was going to have to tell them they were never coming home. Before the Yamato could die, 3,000 men had to be told they were going to. And here is something that makes the whole thing worse. The men did not know. Not the sailors, and not even the captains. The details of this suicide mission had been kept secret right up until the last days. It was only on April 5th that the full orders were finally handed down to the men who would actually carry it out. And when the captains heard it, the reaction was not pride. It was something close to revolt. The briefing provoked what one account calls the closest thing to a mutiny the Navy had seen. These were experienced officers. They heard the plan: sail with no air cover, beach the ship, fight until everyone is dead, and some of them nearly refused outright. This was not a crew hungry to die. This was a crew being told to walk into a fire. Then the order went out to everyone, and the way they did it was almost cold in its simplicity. The special order sending the Yamato to her death was written in large letters, on white paper, and posted on the deck for the men to read. And after the ship got moving, around 2,000 sailors were gathered on the front deck to hear their orders read aloud by the ship's second-in-command. Picture standing in that crowd. 2,000 young men, packed shoulder to shoulder, on the bow of the greatest ship in the Navy, listening to an officer's voice explain in plain words that none of them are expected to come back. No cheering, no glory. Just the cold sea wind and the slow understanding, spreading through the crowd that this was goodbye to everything. The mood aboard was described as miserable and despondent, especially once the men knew it was a one-way trip. And that is the truth this story refuses to hide. These men were not eager. They were heartbroken. They were doing their duty while everything in them screamed against it. But before she sailed, The Yamato did something that, to me, is the most human moment in this entire story. She gave back her children. In the days before the mission, 67 young naval cadets had come aboard. Boys, really. Students from the Naval Academy, freshly arrived, full of dreams about serving on the most famous ship in the fleet. And now the officers faced a terrible choice. Do they take these boys along to certain death, or do they send them away? They sent them away. The cadets were ordered to go ashore, and here's the part that breaks your heart. The boys did not want to go. Many of them begged to stay. They pleaded to be allowed to die with the ship and the men they had just met. But the executive officer, a man named Jiro Nomura, gently and firmly refused them. He sent them off the ship. His reason, in his own words, was simple and devastating. They could not bear to take them along on a journey into certain death. Think about what that tells you about the men who stayed. They were not blind to what waited for them. They understood it so clearly, so completely, that they refused to let these young cadets share it. They knew exactly where they were going. They simply could not save themselves. The way they were saving the boys, the sick were sent ashore too, and the oldest sailors. The ship quietly emptied itself of everyone it could spare from the grave, and then those who remained held a farewell. Sake was poured in a ceremonial goodbye, the men drinking together one last time, saying without saying it that they would never share a drink again. And while they drank, far from the ship, a small act of quiet mercy was unfolding that almost nobody talks about. It has to do with the fuel, and it is one of the most touching details of the whole war. Officially, the orders were brutal even about gasoline. The Naval General Staff instructed the fuel depot to give these ships only enough oil for a one-way trip. Just enough to reach Okinawa and die. Not a drop more. Why waste good fuel on ships that were never coming home? But the men at the fuel depot could not do it. When the Yamato pulled in to take on oil, the workers there quietly disobeyed. Than any single ship had ever faced in the history of the world. Dawn on the April 7th broke gray and heavy. Thick clouds hung low over the East China Sea, and a cold wind chopped the water. The Yamato steamed south through the gloom, her 3,000 men awake now, watching the sky. And the sky was already watching them back. All morning, American flying boats shadowed the Japanese ships. Big patrol planes, circling far off in the clouds, never coming close, just watching, following, reporting. Imagine that feeling. You're sailing toward your death, and out at the edge of sight, a plane is pacing you like a shark, telling the enemy exactly where you are and where you are going. The men on the Yamato could see it out there. They could do nothing about it. The trap they were sailing into was tightening with every mile, and they could only watch it happen. But the Yamato had a secret weapon waiting for the planes. And this is where I have to tell you about one of the strangest, saddest pieces of this whole battle, because the Yamato's last hope had a name. The men called them the beehive shells. Here's what they were. Remember those 9 giant guns, the biggest ever built, the ones that could throw a car 26 miles. For this mission, the Navy had loaded them with a special kind of ammunition, designed for one purpose only, to kill airplanes. Its real name was the Sanshiki shell, the Type 3, but everyone knew it by its nickname, the Beehive, and on paper it sounded like something out of a nightmare. Picture a single shell, over 4 feet long and weighing about 3,000 pounds. It worked like the world's largest shotgun blast. When the Yamato fired it up into a formation of planes, the shell would burst in the sky and spray out. Around 900 little tubes packed with burning chemicals. Each tube would ignite into flame, burning at thousands of degrees, throwing out fire and jagged steel in a wide cone aimed right at the oncoming aircraft. The idea was to create a giant wall of fire in the sky, a curtain of flame that the American planes would have to fly straight through to reach the ship. It sounds terrifying. It sounds unstoppable. A wall of fire from the largest guns on Earth. And here is the heartbreak. It did almost nothing. When the Yamato finally fired these beehive shells at the American planes, the American pilots were not terrified. They were almost amused. They later described the bursts as looking pretty, colorful, dramatic, like fireworks going off in the sky, but not deadly. The shells made a spectacular show and knocked very few planes down. The wall of fire was mostly just light. The planes flew through it and kept coming. It gets worse. The beehive shells may have actually hurt the Yamato's own defense. Firing those enormous main guns threw off the aim of her smaller anti-aircraft guns, and the special shells were even hard on the guns themselves. The Yamato's last secret weapon was, in the end, a beautiful failure. A fireworks display, fired in desperation at men who were not impressed. And that is the perfect, cruel picture of this whole ship. The largest guns ever built, firing the most dramatic shells ever made, and the airplanes simply flew through the light and did their work anyway. Nothing she had was built. For this, nothing she had could save her. She fired her first beehive shells around 10 in the morning at the flying boats. Shadowing her, they were futile. The shells burst, the planes pulled back, and the watching continued. And then came the loneliest moment of all. As the morning went on, American fighters began circling the Japanese fleet, staying just out of range of the guns, calmly waiting. And the Yamato's crew looked up and understood something. That must have hollowed them out completely. No Japanese planes came. There was no help in the sky. Not one friendly fighter rose up to protect them. The Yamato was utterly, totally alone. A single ship and her handful of escorts, sitting under an empty sky, while American planes gathered overhead like crows on a fence. The men could only watch the enemy circle, knowing that this was exactly what Admiral Ito had warned about. No air cover, no protection. Just the sky filling up with their killers and not a single friend among them. Then the radar told them how bad it was about to get. By late morning, the Yamato's radar screens were filling with dots. The two groups of attackers were 44 miles out and closing fast. A warning came in from an island observation post, around 150 American planes were headed straight for them. And that was only the first wave. Let me give you the full staggering number now, because this is the moment the title of this story becomes real. The Americans had launched everything. From 15 aircraft carriers, they sent up a storm of warplanes, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, and the total came to 386 aircraft. 386 against one battleship. Try to picture what that even looks like. Stand on the deck of the Yamato and look up. You're not seeing a few planes. You are seeing the sky itself turn dark with aircraft, wave after wave of them, more than any single ship in the history of the world had ever faced at one time. It was not an attack. It was an avalanche made of metal and fire, and it was falling toward 10 ships, with the great gray giant at the center, marked for death. Now meet a man who watched it all from the front of that doomed parade. His name was Tamechi Hara, and he was the captain of the Yahagi, the light cruiser leading the Japanese formation. Hara was already a legend. In the Japanese Navy, one of its most respected fighting captains, a man who had survived battle after battle in this war. And now he stood on the bridge of his cruiser, out ahead of the Yamato, watching that enormous swarm of American planes pour out of the clouds toward his ships. Hara had seen everything the Pacific War could throw at a man, but this was something new. This was the full, terrible weight of American air power, gathered into one place and aimed at his little fleet. And his ship, the Yahagi, was right out in front. He would soon find his cruiser at the very tip of the storm. At about noon, the avalanche broke. The first wave came screaming in. On the Yamato, Rear Admiral Aruga gave the order, and every gun the ship had opened up at once. The whole battleship became one roaring, shaking weapon, throwing up everything it had into the sky. The giant beehive shells, the hundreds of smaller guns, all of it, filling the air over the ship with smoke and fire and noise. And the planes came on anyway. The attacks came in waves, again and again. Groups of 40 or 50 planes at a time, hammering the ships over and over. Out front, the Yahagi drew some of the first fury, pulling attention away from the Yamato for a few moments. Captain Hera's cruiser became an early target, the planes diving on her as she twisted through the water trying to dodge. This is the picture I need you to hold, because everything else flows from it. One battleship, no friendly planes, the biggest guns in the world, firing shells the enemy thought were fireworks, and bearing down on her from every direction, out of a gray and clouded sky, the single largest air attack ever launched. At one ship, 386 aircraft, in wave after wave, flown by men who already knew, from what happened to the Musashi, that no battleship could survive this. The men of the Yamato knew it too. That was the horror they carried. They had watched their sister ship die exactly. This way, they understood with total clarity that the same death was now falling on them. And still they stood at their guns and fired into the swarm, because there was nothing else left to do. The first bombs were about to find her. The first torpedoes were already in the water. And the Americans had a plan for the Yamato. A clever, brutal plan, worked out from studying how the Musashi had taken so long to die. They were not going to just hit her anywhere and hope. They were going to attack her a very specific way, designed to flip the unsinkable giant over and send her to the bottom as fast as possible. In the next 2 hours, the most powerful ship ever built was going to be taken apart, piece by piece, by the sky. And it started with the water on one side of the ship beginning slowly to rise. The Americans did not attack the Yamato at random. That is the part most people never learn. There was a plan, a cold, brilliant, terrible plan, and it had been built by studying how her sister ship died. When the Musashi sank months earlier, the Americans had watched closely. They saw that she took torpedo hits on both sides of her hull, and hitting both sides, it turned out, kept her balanced. The flooding on the left was answered by flooding on the right, and the giant stayed upright for hours, refusing to die. So for the Yamato, the Americans changed the plan, and the new orders were chillingly simple. The American pilots were told to aim their torpedoes low, hitting the ship below the waterline near the bow and stern, where her armor was thinnest. And more important than that, they were ordered to put their torpedoes into just one side of the ship, only one. The left side, again and again. Do you understand what that does? If you flood only one side of a ship, you do not just sink it, you tip it. You roll it over, the whole weight of the ocean rushing into one side, and nothing balancing it on the other, until the giant simply falls onto her side and capsizes. The Americans had figured out the fastest way to flip the unsinkable ship like a turtle. And now, wave after wave, they carried it out. The first torpedo found her port side, her left side, at around 1:45. And here, the legend of the unsinkable ship met the truth. Because the Yamato's protection against torpedoes was not as strong as everyone believed. She had a hidden weakness in her armor, a weak seam in the very place a torpedo would strike. And her underwater protection was, for reasons no one fully understood, weaker than other navies' ships. On top of that, the Americans were using a powerful new explosive in their torpedoes, more violent than anything from earlier in the war. So that first torpedo did not bounce off, it tore in, and the Yamato swallowed over 2,000 tons of seawater in moments. The unsinkable ship had started to flood with the very first hit. The word everyone had attached to her was already dying. The ship began to lean, to list, sailors call it, to tilt to one side. And the more she tilted, the more danger she was in of rolling all the way over. Which brings us to the most horrifying decision in this entire story. I have told you about the cherry blossoms and the cadets sent ashore. This is the other side of that same coin, and it is brutal. To stop the ship from tipping over, the crew had a tool. Down in the belly of the Yamato were over 1,000 sealed compartments, little rooms that could be flooded on purpose. The idea was simple. If the ship is tipping to the left because the left side is full of water, then you flood some rooms on the right side too, to balance her back out. It is called counter-flooding. You fight flooding with flooding. You let water into your own ship on purpose to keep her level. But here is the unbearable problem. Some of those rooms on the right side were not empty. They were the engine rooms and the boiler rooms, and they were full of men. Sailors at their stations, deep in the heart of the ship, keeping the engines running, doing their jobs in the heat and the noise, with no idea what was about to happen to them. To save the ship from rolling over, Rear Admiral Aruga had to flood those rooms, with the men still inside. Think about that order for a moment. Aruga knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that opening those valves would send the sea pouring into the engine and boiler rooms. He knew the men down there could not get out in time. He was choosing to drown several hundred of his own sailors, to deliberately kill them, to buy the ship a little more time afloat. He gave the order in a choked, broken voice. The valves were opened, and in seconds, the sea crashed in and snuffed out the lives of every man in those flooded rooms. Several hundred sailors, gone in an instant, drowned in the dark by their own ship, on the orders of their own captain. There were no enemy planes in those rooms. No bombs reached them. They were killed by a decision, by the cruel math, of trying to keep a dying giant upright for a few more minutes. They gave their lives without ever firing a shot, without ever even seeing the sky sacrificed in the deepest part of the ship, so that the men up top could fight on a little longer. And it worked for a while. The terrible flooding balanced her out, and the list came back under control. But only for a while, because the planes kept coming. Now look out ahead of the Yamato, to the cruiser leading the way, to Captain Hera's ship, the Yahagi. Remember, the Yahagi had bravely steered away from the Yamato to draw the planes onto herself, trying to protect the bigger ship. She did her job too well. The American planes swarmed her, and a torpedo punched straight into her engine room and killed the entire engine room crew at once, leaving the cruiser dead in the water. Stopped, helpless, unable to move or dodge, a sitting target. From there, it was slaughter. The Yahagi was hit again and again. By the time she finally went under, she had absorbed around a dozen bombs and 7 torpedoes, a staggering amount of punishment for a ship her size. And Captain Tamechi Hara, the legendary fighter, the man who had survived so many battles, finally reached the end of the line. With his ship sinking beneath him, Hera gave the order to abandon her. He and his admiral kicked off their shoes and jumped into the sea. The leader of the whole parade was now in the water, swimming for his life, watching the rest of his fleet die around him. And then came the blow that sealed the Yamato's fate. A torpedo struck near her steering room, the part of the ship that controls which way she turns. The hit killed the entire crew in that compartment and jammed her rudder, locking it hard over to one side. And just like that, the Yamato lost the ability to steer. This is the moment her death became certain. A ship that cannot steer, cannot dodge. She was now locked into a slow, helpless circle, crawling along on her last working engine at a crippled crawl, turning in the same useless curve over and over, while the planes lined up their shots at their leisure. The most powerful battleship ever built had been reduced to a wounded animal, dragging itself in circles, unable to run, unable to turn, unable to do anything but take the next hit, and the next, and the next. Her speed bled away. Down to one engine, she slowed to a crawl of around 8 knots, barely faster than a man can run. The radio room flooded, so her officers could no longer even send messages by wireless. They were reduced to signaling with flags and lights like sailors from 100 years before, as their 20th century giant died beneath them. And the list, that deadly tilt to one side, was coming back. Worse this time. The counter-flooding had bought time, but the time was running out. The tilt passed 15 degrees. Then it kept going, leaning toward 20. Soon the crew had flooded every room they could on the high side. There was nothing left to balance her with. All the safety compartments were full. The ship had no more tricks. From here, every new torpedo on the low side would only tip her further toward the point of no return. Men were clinging to railings now, the decks slanting under their feet. Through the smoke and the explosions, one survivor remembered the captain's voice, cutting through the chaos, shouting to his men to hold on. Hold on. But there was nothing left to hold on to. The ship was rolling, slowly, terribly, onto her side. Up on the towering bridge, high above the dying deck, two men understood that the end had come. Two men who had carried this ship's fate from the very beginning. One was Rear Admiral Aruga, the captain, the man, who had given the order to drown his own engine crews. The other was Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito. Ito, the man who had begged them not to send the Yamato. The man who had said no, who had been right about everything, who had warned that this exact death was waiting in the sky. He had stood on that bridge through the whole battle and said almost nothing, watching his terrible prediction come true, watching his 3,000 men die exactly as he had feared. And now, as the ship rolled beneath him, Ito was about to do two things. He was going to give the one and only order he gave that entire day. And then he was going to make a choice about his own life that would echo for 80 years. High on the tilting bridge, Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito finally spoke. He had stood there through the whole battle, mostly silent, watching the disaster he had predicted come true in front of his eyes. Every warning he had given had come to pass. No air cover, a swarm from the sky, his ship rolling over beneath him. He had been right about all of it, and being right had saved no one. Now, bracing himself against a stand on the bridge, he gave the only direct order he had given all day. Two simple ideas. Stop the operation, turn back, and save the men. Think about the weight of those words coming from him. From the very start, Ito had called this mission a senseless sacrifice. He had begged them not to do it. He had been overruled and forced to sail. And now, at the bitter end, with most of his men dead or dying, his final act of command was to call it off, to try, in the last moments, to save whoever was left. The mission was over. There was no Okinawa. There was no glorious last stand on a beach. There was only a sinking ship and the simple human goal of getting the survivors out of the water. And then Ito did the thing this whole story has been moving toward. He shook hands, slowly and deliberately, with each of his staff officers, a quiet goodbye, man to man, on a bridge that was leaning toward the sea. And then he turned and walked down, into his cabin, alone, to go down with the ship. That was the last anyone ever saw of Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito. He did not have to die. He could have swum. He had opposed this mission with everything in him. He, of all people, had earned the right to live, but Ito chose to stay. He chose to sink with the ship and the men he could not save. Whatever you think of the war he fought in, sit for a second with the terrible dignity of that choice. The man who said no, dying with the men he tried to save from a death he never wanted for them. One of his young officers, his personal adjutant, tried to follow him down to die alongside him. He had to be physically held back by another officer and forced to live. That is the kind of moment this was. Men fighting, not to escape death, but to be allowed to share it. A few feet away, the captain of the Yamato, Rear Admiral Aruga, made the same choice in his own way. He had a messenger help him tie himself to the ship's compass stand, lashing his own body to the bridge so that, even in death, he could not be washed away. He would go down with his ship, and he would make sure of it. You have heard this exact choice before in this story. Remember the Musashi, the sister ship, months earlier. Her captain, Inoguchi, did the same thing, turned over command and went down with his ship on purpose. Now the Yamato's captain followed him into the same dark water. It was almost a ritual. The ship dies, and her captain dies with her. But not everyone was allowed to stay. This is the part that to me holds all the heartbreak of that bridge. The senior officers had decided to die, but they would not let the young ones throw their lives away. The chief of staff thundered at the young sailors to get into the water and swim, to live. The captain himself ordered a young ensign off the bridge. These old men, who had chosen death for themselves, used their last breaths to chase the young men toward life. "Swim," they shouted. "Go, live, get off this ship." And in the middle of all this, there was a small, strange, beautiful moment that says everything about these men. The captain asked what had become of the portrait of the emperor, the sacred image carried aboard the ship, and the officer whose job it was to protect it answered that he was guarding it with his life. The ship is rolling over. Men are about to die by the thousands, and someone is still standing watch over a framed portrait, faithful to the very last second. Now I want to tell you about one young sailor on that ship, because his story holds the whole tragedy in a single letter. His name was Nakatani, and just before the Yamato sailed on her final voyage, Nakatani had received a letter from his mother. His mother was in America. Let that sink in. A Japanese sailor, about to die fighting the United States, had a mother living in the very country his ship was sailing to fight. The letter had traveled a long, strange path through a neutral country to reach him. And in it, his mother wrote simple, loving words. She told him she was fine. She told him to do his best, and she asked him to join her in one quiet hope that they both pray for peace. Pray for peace. A mother in America, a son on the Yamato on opposite sides of a terrible war, both wishing for the same thing. And now that son was on a sinking ship in the East China Sea, with his mother's words in his heart. That single letter is the whole madness of war, folded into one page. The people on both sides were just people, mothers and sons, all of them wanting the killing to stop, and all of them caught in it anyway. Then the sea took the Yamato. She had been leaning further and further, and now she went, past the point of no return. The great ship rolled all the way onto her side, tilting to 80, then 90 degrees, until she was lying flat on the water, her giant deck, standing straight up like a wall. Deep inside her, in the magazines where the ammunition was stored, the massive shells broke loose and went sliding and crashing across the compartments, smashing into the walls, beginning to spark and burn. Men slid helplessly off the steep decks into the sea, and countless others, trapped deep inside. The rolling hull with no way out went down with her into the dark. For a moment, she lay there on her side, this dying giant, and began to slip under. And then the Yamato exploded at 23 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. The fire reached her main ammunition stores, and the ship blew apart. Not a small blast, one of the largest explosions ever to happen at sea. The detonation tore the enormous ship in half. It threw up a tower of smoke and fire almost 20,000 feet into the sky, nearly 4 miles high, a black mushroom cloud rising over the ocean like something from the end of the world. How big was that explosion? Let me give you the yardstick, and it will tell you everything. That cloud of smoke and fire could be seen from 120 miles away on the mainland of Japan. People standing on the shore more than 100 miles distant looked out to sea and saw the death of the Yamato written on the sky. The blast was so violent that it was felt and recorded far, far from the spot where she died. And here is the bitter final irony of this whole story. Remember those giant guns, the largest ever built, that fired the beehive shells? The Americans laughed off as fireworks through the entire battle. All that firepower had barely scratched the enemy planes. But the explosion of her own death did what her guns never could. The blast was so enormous that it knocked several American planes out of the sky, planes that had been circling overhead to watch her die. The Yamato's deadliest blow against the enemy was the moment of her own destruction. She killed more of them dying than she ever did fighting. That is the whole tragedy of this ship in one final, terrible image, all that power, and the only time it truly struck the enemy was when it was tearing her apart. And what of the men who had jumped into the water? The young ones the officers had ordered to swim and live. For many of them, the sea was just another way to die. As the giant ship went down, she dragged the water around, her down with her, sucking the swimming men under into the depths. And then the explosion ripped through that water, killing many of the very men who had managed to escape the deck. One of those men was young Mitsuru Yoshida, the radar officer from the very start of our story, the one watching. The dots fill his screen that morning. Yoshida was pulled deep underwater as the ship sank. He should have drowned down there in the dark. But then the magazines exploded, and the force of that blast did something almost impossible. It blew him back, up to the surface. The same explosion that killed so many. Others threw Yoshida up into the daylight alive. Survivors later described the nightmare of it being heaved and tossed and pounded by the sea, fighting toward a faint greenish light far above, and somehow being spat back out into the air, gasping, alive, in a sea full of oil and fire and the dead. And then, suddenly, it was quiet. The most powerful battleship ever built was gone. In a little over 2 hours, 386 aircraft had taken the unsinkable giant apart and sent her to the bottom of the sea. She came to rest on the sea floor, more than 1,000 feet down, around 50 miles from the coast of Japan. Broken in two, where she still lies today, where the greatest warship in the world had been, there was now only an oil-slicked sea, a sky full of black smoke, and a scattering of survivors clinging to wreckage in the cold water. A handful of men, out of thousands, bobbing in the waves, watching the smoke of their ship drift across the sky. The destroyers that were left began to move toward them, to pull the living from the sea before it was too late. But the cost of this single afternoon, the true, full price of Japan's pride, was almost beyond counting. And the numbers, when you finally hear them, are going to land harder than any explosion. Because for every man pulled alive from that water, many, many more were never coming home. The destroyers that were still afloat came back for the men in the water. 3 of them, the Fuyutsuki, the Yukikaze, and the Hatsushimo, moved through the oil and the wreckage, pulling survivors from the sea. They worked fast, because American planes were still about, and the water was cold and full of the dead. One by one, they hauled the living up out of the waves, burned, choking on oil, barely alive. And when they were finished, when they had searched as long as they dared and turned for home, the full and terrible cost of this single afternoon began to come clear. Now, I have to be honest with you about the numbers, because the exact count has never been fully settled. Different records give slightly different figures, and historians still disagree on the precise total, but the shape of it is not in doubt, and the shape of it is staggering. Out of a crew of more than 3,000 men, only around 270 survived. Let me say that a different way, so it lands. Remember when I told you the Yamato carried a crew the size of a small town? Picture that town. 3,000 men, fathers, sons, brothers, friends, and then picture all of them gone, except for a couple hundred. Roughly 3,000 men died in a little over 2 hours. An entire town's worth of people erased from one ship in one afternoon. The survivors were a tiny handful. Fewer than 1 man in 10 walked away. And that was just the Yamato. The cruiser Yahagi, Captain Hera's ship, the one that led the parade, lost around 450 of her 1,000 men. The destroyers were torn apart too. Some were sunk with nearly everyone aboard. Others were so broken they had to be sunk by their own side. One destroyer, the Suzutsuki, had her entire front end blown off, and the only way her crew got her home was by steaming backwards the whole way, driving a broken ship in reverse across the sea to reach port. Add it all together, across the Yamato and her escorts, and the Japanese lost somewhere in the range of 4,000 men in this one operation. 4,000. And now I'm going to tell you what it bought them, because this is the number that makes Admiral Ito's warning ring across all these years. This is the number that proves he was right. The Americans, who killed all those men and sank all those ships, lost only about 10 aircraft, 10 planes. Stop and feel the size of that gap. Roughly 4,000 Japanese sailors, the greatest battleship ever built, a cruiser, and several destroyers, traded for about 10 American airplanes. That is not a battle. That is not even a fight. That is exactly what Ito said it would be from the very beginning. A senseless sacrifice. He had stood up, alone, against the whole weight of his navy and his emperor, and said, "This will kill my men for nothing." And the final tally proved him right down to the last awful detail. 3,000 men on the Yamato died, and they did not change the battle for Okinawa by one single inch. The island fell anyway. The war was lost anyway. They died for a gesture, for pride, for the feeling that the Navy had to do something, even something hopeless. And here is the cruelest twist of all, the one that ties this whole story into a knot around the heart. You remember Vice Admiral Ito, the man who opposed the mission, the man who was right, the man who chose to go down with his ship rather than save himself. 10 days after Ito died on the Yamato, his only son was killed too. His son was a young pilot, and he died flying a kamikaze attack near Okinawa, flying his own plane, on purpose, into the enemy, in the same desperate, hopeless way that Ito had begged the Navy not to throw lives away. Think about that. The father stood against the suicide mission with everything he had, and was forced to die on one. And 10 days later, his boy climbed into a plane and flew his own suicide mission to his death. In the very same waters, a father and his only son, both swallowed up by the same terrible idea, within 10 days of each other. Ito could not save his 3,000 men, and he could not save his own son either. The thing he fought against took everyone, including the boy he loved most. That is what pride cost, not just ships and steel. Sons, fathers. The man on the Yamato with a mother in America praying for peace. The young cadets who begged to stay and die. Ito's boy in his cockpit. All of them fed into a fire that no one in charge would admit had already burned the war to ashes. So what did the death of the Yamato actually mean? Why does this one ship, out of all the ships that died in that war, still matter? It matters because the Yamato was the end of an entire age. For hundreds of years, the most powerful thing on the ocean had been the big ship with the big guns. That was the king of the sea. That was what every navy dreamed of building. And the Yamato was the ultimate version of that dream. The biggest, the strongest, the most heavily armed battleship that human beings ever made or ever will make. And she was destroyed in a single afternoon by airplanes, having barely fired her great guns at an enemy in her entire life. Her death marked the end of the battleship era. After the Yamato, the message was impossible to ignore. The airplane and the aircraft carrier now ruled the waves. The day of the giant gun was over. The most expensive, most powerful, most secret weapon Japan ever built had been made obsolete before it was even finished, and the proof was now lying in 2 pieces on the bottom of the sea. Just 5 months after the Yamato went down, Japan surrendered, and the war was over. She was a monument to a way of war that was already dead. She just had to sink before everyone would believe it, and the men who lived through it never let the world forget. Remember young Mitsuru Yoshida, the radar officer from the first moments of our story, the one watching the dots crowd onto his screen, the one blasted back to the surface by the explosion. Yoshida survived the war, and he went on to live a full life and become a successful banker. But he could never put down what he had seen, so he wrote it all down. A book about the Yamato's final voyage, told from the inside, by a man who was there. He wrote it so the 3,000 would not just be a number, so that someone someday would know what it was really like on that bridge as the ship rolled over. Because of Yoshida and the few others who survived and spoke, we can still hear their voices today. 80 years later, the Yamato herself is still down there. She lies broken in two, more than 1,000 feet beneath the surface, about 50 miles off the coast of Japan, in the cold and the dark where she came to rest in 1945. Explorers have gone down to find her, to film her quiet grave, to map the wreckage of the greatest ship that ever sailed. And the families never forgot either. Many years later, on the same waters, more than 280 family members and survivors sailed out together to honor the dead, following the Yamato's exact route, out past the same shores, to the place where she died. Old men who had been young sailors, children and grandchildren of the men who never came back, gathered on the sea where it all ended, to remember. So let me leave you with the truth at the center of this whole story. The Yamato was not unsinkable. That word was a lie from the start, a beautiful, dangerous lie that a proud nation told itself. She was the most powerful ship ever built, and it did not save her, and it did not save her men, and it did not save the war. In the end, the Yamato was destroyed not by the strength of her enemies, but by the pride of her own leaders. She was lost not because she was weak, but because she was sent, knowingly, needlessly, into a battle that everyone aboard understood they could not win. And she is remembered today, not for the ships she sank, but for the 3,000 men she carried down with her into the dark. The biggest guns in the world could not stop the smallest planes, and the greatest battleship ever built became, in the end, the greatest monument to a single, simple human mistake: the refusal to admit, until it was far too late, that the world had already changed. That is the story of the Yamato, the unsinkable ship that sank, the giant